Hey guys, we're finally in the countries. We're finally getting our first case country today, and that is the United Kingdom. So why does virtually every comparative government type class start with the UK? Well, there's several reasons, okay? First, it is the world's oldest democracy, beginning its gradual transition in the 13th century, and it continues its evolution to this day. It is also one of only a handful of countries that lacks a written constitution, instead relying on a large body of laws and traditions to guide its political system. The UK was also the first country in the world to industrialize, owing in part to its development of liberal political ideologies. So this makes the UK a fascinating historical case, but the country also remains influential in regional and global politics. Margaret Thatcher was a significant figure in the political promotion of neoliberal economic thought, which continues to dominate many conservative parties, including the US Republican Party, to this day. Tony Blair serves a similar role, promoting his third way, a shift from leftist parties, for leftist parties, not from, for leftist parties that involved adopting more social justice and more middle class positions. Finally, Prime Minister Theresa May, who's currently there, has begun the process of negotiating the UK's exit from the European Union, making them the first country ever to leave this regional organization, a supranational organization. Talked about that, chapter 7. Not mentioned specifically in the book, however, is but worth mentioning here is how the United Kingdom shaped the political, the economic, the social institutions in countries around the world because of their colonial empire. The United States, Nigeria, India. These are just a few examples of countries who owe their development of their political and their legal systems, in part at least, to the British heritage. So to start with, we want to look at the historic developments within the UK. And originally we've got lots of invasions. The Celts, the Romans, the Angles, the Saxons, the Danes, the Normans, they're all invading what is now the United Kingdom. And each one of them would leave an impact on the development of the United Kingdom. But the most influential of these is going to be the Normans, the Norman invasion of 1066. Now, the Normans imported feudalism and a legal code based on a new feudal court system, which would evolve into common law legal systems. And so that's going to be key for the United Kingdom. Now, the emergence of the modern British state has its roots all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. The Magna Carta is a promise to uphold feudal rights. Again, feudal from the Normans in 1066. 200 years later, we have the Magna Carta, which started the trend of limiting the monarchy. And we're going to see this trend move forward. King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 after an uprising among the UK nobility. The UK would also shift power away from religious political figures surprisingly early, in part because of Henry VIII. Henry VIII wanted a divorce. His current wife was not able to give him a male heir, and he wanted one to pass on the monarchy. But the Catholic Church would not grant this divorce. And because he desired access to the church's resources, Henry VIII used Parliament to pass laws taking England out of the Catholic Church. He would replace the Catholic Church's authority with the Anglican Church, whose official head is the British monarch. So he gets to be in charge of the church. Okay, Henry VIII's decision would have several long-term impacts for the United Kingdom and the world. First, as Henry VIII gained his authority for this action through the Parliament, this action legitimized a lot of the power of the Parliament. Since he asked them for the power, he shows, I need the power from the Parliament. They need to give me that power. Therefore, they must have power to give already. Okay. Second, it would set the stage for later battles over power and, at least on the surface, over religious differences. While England's nobility largely converted to Protestantism, Peasant classes and the local nobility in Scotland and Ireland in particular would remain Catholic. Okay? Existing class and power relations, therefore, became aligned upon religious identities, especially in the Celtic fringe. Religion would also play a part in the power struggles leading up to the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So James I was a Scot and abolitionist, absolutist, who raised taxes without asking Parliament. His son Charles I married into the French nobility, and so these were Catholic and they believed in the divine rights of kings. So Charles attempts to flaunt his royal power and the Parliament's fear of outside influence, that French Catholicism, would ultimately culminate in the English Civil War and ultimately Charles I's beheading. Okay, from there, we want to look at the evolution of the Parliament, okay? And we want to look at it as a dominant force over the monarchy. The monarchy was replaced by a republic and led by Prime Minister Oliver Cromwell, but Cromwell's rule soon devolved into a brutal military dictatorship, ultimately leading to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Charles I's son, Charles II, ascended a monarchy whose power was forever weakened then. Following Charles II's death, his brother James II ascended the throne, and James had spent time in France, leading to his conversion to Catholicism. Many members of the British aristocracy also suspected him of having pro-French sympathies, a concern that increased after his second marriage to an Italian and Catholic princess. While tensions emerged with the Protestant nobility over James' open practice of Catholicism, James was seen as old, and many nobles expected that he would soon be succeeded by his oldest daughter. Mary, who was a Protestant and who had married a Dutch Protestant, William of Orange. However, two factors would finally shift Parliament away from supporting the king. First, after facing two rebellions during his rule, James sought to greatly increase his power by building up his military, often by granting special rights to Catholics commanding these regiments and by packing Parliament with his own supporters. So they feared that James was preparing to battle the Protestant parliamentary aligned forces, and the final straw came when James produced a son, a Catholic heir. Parliament exiled him and named Mary and her husband William III dual monarchs, an event that became known as the Glorious Revolution. Important to know that. As part of the agreement between Parliament and William and Mary, the new monarchs agreed to the passage of the 1689 Bill of Rights, which was a document that further weakened the power of the king, and it set out the basis for civil rights, including the creation of rule by law, trial by jury, freedom of speech, several things like that, similar to what we think of when we see our Bill of Rights. James attempted to reclaim the throne with the support of French monarch Louis XIV and his Jacobite forces, but he was ultimately defeated in 1690. Since this time, the British monarchy has owed their position to the Parliament. The final shift in power from the monarchy towards the Parliament would be crowning George I, the first of the current British dynastic family. George I was a German royal and spoke hardly any English. For this reason, he was forced to rely heavily on his cabinet and the prime minister for the day-to-day governing of the country. And one of his prime ministers, Sir Robert Walpole, who governed from 1721 to 42, fashioned the office of the prime minister into what it is today. So since the late 18th century, the cabinet and the prime ministers have been chosen by Parliament, not the monarch. And this shift occurred largely in reaction to the loss of the American colonies, which was seen as widely mishandled due to the monarchy. So from the 16th to the 19th centuries, while all this is happening, the UK would vanquish its main European rivals to become the world's dominant military, and not just military, but commercial and cultural power. By the 19th century, the United Kingdom governed a quarter of the world's population, directly ruled nearly 50 countries and dominated the global commercial economy. The saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had colonies all around the world. So the sun was always shining somewhere that was part of Britain. The empire's erosion was as slow as its growth had been. The American colonies was lost in the late 18th century. We know that, right? Ireland and Egypt were granted independence after World War One. After World War II, the UK could no longer hold out against increasing international demands for self-determination, and most of the remaining empire was dismantled by the 1950s. A few territories remained. In 1982, the British successfully fought a war with Argentina over control of the Falkland Islands. But in 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, so that territory was lost as well. While the empire no longer exists, obviously we know that, the Commonwealth maintains ties between the United Kingdom and 54 former colonies. Its purpose is to maintain economic and cultural ties from colonial times. One interesting example of these ties are the Commonwealth Games, a highly prestigious international sporting event similar to the Olympics, in which teams from the Commonwealth compete. The UK was the world's first industrial society, which was helped by and in turn expanded the reach of their empire. Industrialization led to a number of societal changes, and these are important. Urbanization increased because workers moved from the countryside into the cities to find jobs in manufacturing. Because the UK faced little international competition for business, industrialization also resulted in tremendous wealth and the growth of a new merchant middle class. This middle class, in turn, would increasingly demand access to political power. And where are they going to find it? In the parliament, right? So that further helps the UK's gradual shift towards democracy and away from monarchy. So the early industrialization, however, may also explain why the UK has such an economic decline by the 20th century. British manufacturing infrastructure is often older and less efficient than those of later economies, who are able to develop the newest technologies when it comes to economic investments. The rise of new competitors in international markets and an obsolete infrastructure has meant that UK manufacturing, once the leader, the elite in the world, now lags behind most developed countries and even some developing countries. So just like the UK's regime slowly transitioned from monarchy to democracy, the political institutions that make up the British democracy have also been slow to evolve. The palace at Westminster, where the UK Parliament meets, actually began in the 11th century as the King's Court. Over time, the House of Lords emerged to represent the aristocracy, with the House of Commons emerging to represent the lower nobility, and much later, the new merchant class. Two factors gradually led to the democratization of Parliament and the weakening of the nobility. First, we have political parties are emerging to support either the Tories or opposing the Whigs, the monarchy. So the Tories are for the monarch, the Whigs are against the monarch, and those political parties are starting to form. We know from the Federalist Papers what Madison would say about the factions, right? Fed 10. A little connection there from AP Gov for you people. To help with political conflicts, though, the Whigs sought support of the UK's growing commercial class, many of whom were excluded from power up until now. Second, in 1832, the Whigs were able to pass a Reform Act that doubled the size of the British electorate. While 90% of the British adults were still unable to vote, over the next century, both parties gradually supported measures to expand suffrage, as a way to gain political support in the new electorate. Women were given the right to vote in 1928, and 1969, all adults that were 18 and older were allowed to vote. So these new voters, both middle and working class, pushed for state action on public goods such as better working conditions, healthcare, education, housing. They also formed new political parties. And so in 1900, the Labor Party emerges as an outgrowth of the trade union movement. Today, Labor is one of the two larger parties in the British political system. The 2010 election resulted in a hung parliament, which means no party had a majority of the seats. Cameron and the Conservatives formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. In the 2015 election, the Tories won a clear majority in the parliament. In 2016, Cameron agreed to place a referendum. Circle that word, referendum. We want to know that. Look it up in your books. If you don't know what it means, you should know what it means because you're a Cavalier. But referendum. Cameron agrees to place a referendum on Brexit before voters. And as a result, that shocked the world, voters chose to leave the option to withdraw the United Kingdom from the European Union. As a consequence, Cameron resigns and Theresa May becomes Prime Minister, and she vows to take the necessary steps to Brexit. So this is all interlaced in those political parties, okay? So let's talk about the political regime in the UK. You know the difference between regimes and governments, right? Right? Yeah, you do. That's just another reason that you rock, right? Okay, so instead of one constitution, the UK political system is shaped by several documents and unwritten rules, plus acts of parliament, judicial decisions, and traditions. Parliament is viewed as sovereign, which means that the House of Commons can amend the Constitution by a simple majority vote. Okay. It also means that unlike the U.S., which has the Supreme Court, which is able to rule on constitutional issues, the U.K. has historically lacked a true constitutional court. No constitution, no constitutional court, right? Makes sense. While some praise the UK system as being highly adaptable, others have expressed concern. Because the UK lacks constitutional guarantees, human rights advocates have increasingly demanded some sort of written protection for basic rights. European politics has been one way human rights laws have become increasingly formalized. In 1998, the UK government incorporated with the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, into national laws, creating a basic set of constitutional liberties. When the 2007, the Lisbon Treaty was signed by members of the EU, the ECHR was made legally binding on all EU members. What Brexit means for human rights law in the UK is only one of many issues that will be addressed as part of the separation agreement that's still going on. They're still trying to figure out. So the first institution that we've got to talk about in the UK is the Crown. The Crown is a branch of government. They do not have just a legislative, a executive, and a judiciary in the UK as we do in the United States. The Crown is considered a branch of government. The Crown is a branch of government along with the judiciary, the legislature, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. Now, the monarch is the head of the state in a largely ceremonial position. The monarch is essentially a paid civil servant whose expenses are budgeted and allocated by the government. The main reason why the British monarchy has survived is because it agreed to act according to constitutional rules. While historically based on primogeniture favoring male heirs, in 2011, male precedence in royal succession was abolished by law by the Cameron government. And so the current monarch is Elizabeth II, who celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, which means 60 years on the throne, in 2012. The next institution is the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is the most powerful head of government in any contemporary democracy. This is the person with the real power in the UK, the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the head of the largest party in the House of Commons. A pure formality requires that the monarch name the prime minister and ask him or her to form a government. But it is the prime minister who really selects the cabinet, okay? The one thing that can always hang over the prime minister is a vote of no confidence. If the government feels a measure is important but the legislature rejects it, then either the entire cabinet has to resign and be replaced by another one, or elections have to be called. So this is a vote of no confidence. We do not believe what you are doing is good. We need to get rid of you, okay? Prime ministers typically have very strong oratorical skills and are veterans of party politics with an average of 20 years already in the House of Commons. Thatcher and Blair are two that you gotta know, but we're gonna go through more of them in class. We're going all the way back to World War II with our prime ministers, because you gotta know these people. But Thatcher and Blair are super important. They are opposite parties, but they're similar in some ways. Both are very charismatic, and so we talked about charismatic legitimacy, right? They stepped down without losing an election, and they handed over power to non-charismatic successors, John Major and Gordon Brown, respectively. The prime minister must maintain support for party members of parliament, appear for televised question periods, direct the cabinet, guide party to victory in general elections, and hold together fractions if they're in coalitions. Okay, so prime minister, super powerful in the UK. But let's go ahead and take a look at the cabinet and the legislature. All members of the cabinet are members of parliament. Okay, so that's important to know, that if you're in the cabinet, you're also a member of parliament. The most important ministries are the Foreign Office, which is foreign policy, the Home Office, which is oversight of the judiciary, and Exchequer, which is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, oversees financial policy as head of the central bank. Okay, so collective responsibility. An individual cabinet member who opposes government policy must still vote for it and must assume responsibility, or else resign and return to the legislature and let somebody else into that spot. Okay, party discipline is a term that is not used in the book, but it describes how parties matter more than individual legislatures, who tend to vote the party line rather than what their constituents back home would want. In fact, 90% of the time, members of parliament are going to vote with their party over what their constituents might do. Even though parliament is the most powerful legislature on earth, it mainly deliberates issues that the executive raises. So the executive is going to raise the agenda. The parliament is then going to act on it. There are currently 650 members of parliament in the House of Commons and over 800 in the House of Lords. With the House of Lords, we find life peers. They are appointed by the Crown for life on recommendation of the Prime Minister. Law lords are also appointed for life and are top legal experts, and hereditary peers are aristocrats is the movie, right? Well, we don't need them. Aristocrats who can bequeath their title to their offspring. Labor eliminated most of the hereditary peers in 1999, and there are only 92 left. Lords cannot vet legislature, but they can delay it. Okay, I would highlight that. They cannot vet legislature, but they can delay it. They have a lot of legal expertise and are used to function as the court of last appeal. But now there is a Supreme Court, and so things are changing a little bit. We're going to get to that in just a minute. So like many democracies, the UK has an elaborate hierarchy of civil and criminal courts and a complex appeals court system. However, we compare it to other democracies, the UK is notably lacking a clear constitutional court. Talked about that. No constitution, no constitutional court. In part due to historic dominance of the parliament in British politics. There have been slow movement toward greater political power for the courts with a new Supreme Court created in 2009. The Supreme Court is up and running, and its description does not list Scotland as it's in its jurisdiction, because Scotland has its own high court of the judiciary. While current members of the Supreme Court are law lords, members of the House of Lords, their successors will instead be chosen by a commission. There's several reasons why the judicial branch has increased its power and influence in recent decades. First, British governments are increasingly seeking legal interpretations as a way to support their actions. Second, the embrace of international law, such as the adoption of the ECHR that we talked about earlier, has given the courts new authority to strike down legislation as unconstitutional, especially in areas pertaining to civil rights. A final important thing to note is that the legal system in the UK are based on common law legal traditions, which compares to the stricter code law systems in the rest of Europe. Common law systems rely more on precedent and interpretation, and the main actors, the judges, the lawyers, the advocates, play a much different role than they do in other legal systems. So let's go ahead and shift gears just a little bit here to the electoral systems in the UK. The UK uses single-member districts with first-past-the-post winners, otherwise known as winner-take-all. Constituencies are based on population, and they are revised every 5 to 7 years. So that's similar to the United States with the census for the House of Representatives. There is a government commission to revise the constituencies. This type of electoral process penalizes smaller parties. For example, the Liberal Democrats win 20 to 25% of the vote in several districts, but they hardly amounts to anything. They don't win seats in Parliament, okay, because of that first past the post. The system is lopsided. It produces very clear majorities in the House of Commons, even where there is no majority of comparable magnitude in the electorate. In regional legislatures, for Scotland and Wales, there's a mixed system. This is supported by the Labour Party, which is a big beneficiary of first past the post nationally, but fears the same system would give majorities to local nationalist parties. Scotland has more and stronger nationalist tendencies than Wales, so its legislature is more powerful. And then we come to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which is an agreement between the Irish and the Protestants and the Irish Catholics that allowed for establishment of the Northern Ireland Assembly. So the UK is considered, we just talk about all these regional governments, but the UK is considered a unitary state with no formal powers reserved for regional local governments. However, different leaders have treated local governments differently. Thatcher tried to reduce local power. Blair tried to increase it. Since 2010, Conservatives have continued to grant more authority to local governments. This is especially true outside of England, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, where regional governments have gained strength. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the party system in the UK. The UK uses a multi-party with no majority of votes since 1935. In England, there are three major parties: the Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats, which compete with one another. And in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the regional national parties compete with the three major ones. So the Labour Party is up first. The Labour Party is an outgrowth of the labor union movement. That's how it gets its name. It became significant after World War I and won in a landslide after World War II in 1945. It holds socialism as its main ideology, but in a moderate version informed by Fabianism, which promoted working within the parliamentary system towards social democracy. Radicals and moderates created division in the party, so it had no electoral victory from 79 to 97, and it was Blair who abandoned the commitment to socialism and created the Third Way, which favored moderate free market policies. Blair becomes the party leader in 1994 and won elections in 97, 2001, and 2005. During the final term, he resigned because his support for the Iraq War was not popular. Gordon Brown would take over in 2007, but in 2010, Brown would step down because his party was doing poorly electorally, and Ed Miliband took over. Miliband was stepped down in 2015, in which the Conservatives got a majority now. An internal vote was held in the Labour Party in September 2015 to pick the next party leader, and that winner was Jeremy Corbyn. The Conservatives are moderate and pragmatic and generally support a modern welfare state. In the 1970s, there was a break between pragmatic moderates and neoliberals. Neoliberals are going to be all free market supporters. Thatcher's election as prime minister in '79 meant that the victory of the neoliberal wing of the Conservative Party. Cameron promised in 2014 that he would renegotiate Britain's EU membership and bring it to a referendum. And in the referendum it held in 2016, voters chose to leave the European Union, prompting Cameron to resign, and Theresa May was elevated to prime minister. Now, the Liberal Democrats arose recently, 1988, so 30 years, but recently, from a merger of the Liberal Party and those who broke away from Labor. They are typically understood as close to Labor, but in 2004 they adopted neutrality and announced that they would enter into a coalition with any of the major parties in order to get their platform accomplished. They focus on individual freedoms as well as on equality, and there is an electoral reform. Their power will not diminish. The United Kingdom Independence Party, the UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, has struggled to win seats in the British Parliament. They've only won one in 2015, but perhaps ironically had greater success in winning seats in the European Parliament. The UKIP and its leader, Nigel Farage, were strong proponents for Brexit, riding a wave of so-called Europhobia among British voters. So the electoral system makes it nearly impossible for small parties to do much in national politics, though they are very active in local politics. The Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, and Sinn Féin are a few of the regional parties that have dominance in some district and win some seats in legislatures. In the general election, 650 House of Commons seats are filled by the electorate. The 60 to 70% turnout is well below the European levels, but far above the US rate. And campaigns last about a month is all. And all parties have clear platform documents and high party discipline, voting for the party, and the candidate is not nearly as important. In fact, some candidates don't even live in the district that they represent. When we examine the civil society now, the last part of this, the civil society in the UK, we see that, like the US, the UK has a significant number of groups articulating special interests. However, due to the UK's stricter party discipline, unlike the US, these groups tend to focus more on lobbying party leadership than they do the individual members of parliament. So many groups gain influence by participating in Quangos, Quangos, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations, which act as policy advisory boards, and they work closely with government officials to develop policy. Major groups in the UK include the Trade Union Congress, which represent the UK's largest trade unions and historically active in labour politics, and the Confederation of British Industry, which represents business organizations. Okay, so when we look at the UK in terms of social cleavages, we see again that the UK is weird. Okay, I said it. They're weird. They don't have a constitution. The way that they do things, we look at it and we're like, what? When we look at social cleavages, we see that they're weird. Again, the UK should tear itself apart. They should not get along like they do. The UK should tear itself apart, but considering its diversity, the UK demonstrates remarkable national unity and political stability. Okay, some social cleavages to know in the UK would be education, self-identification, class, leisure activities. Okay, so let's look at the cleaves in ethnic identity. The United Kingdom is more secular than most European countries, and it's far more secular than the United States, having legalized abortion and gay rights back in the 1960s. Religion is an issue in Northern Ireland, where 48% of the population is Protestant, and 45% is Catholic. In the 1960s, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and the British Army retaliated. The period of conflict known as the Troubles began then and lasted for 3 decades. It ends with the Good Friday Agreement, where that said that the IRA would give up their armed struggle in exchange for reform, allowing a greater role for Catholics in local government. Immigration from former colonies brings a certain level of racial diversity to the UK, which parliaments tried to stem with quotas on non-white dependents who can join family members already residing in the United Kingdom. Race or religion or ethnicity and religion, Muslims are not integrated. Okay, nationality means not seeing oneself as British, but as English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish. This is important because they're kind of split geographically, and they hold to those nations first before the United Kingdom. In 2011, riots broke out in London and other cities, fueled by anger over recession, growing inequality, austerity measures, conflicts over immigration, multiculturalism. In the wake of Brexit now, May endeavors to maintain the benefits of European integration while disentangling the United Kingdom from many of its obligations in the EU. So we've got all these different things. Let's return to those cleaves of the national identity. We see the UK is made up of 4 nations: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. But most citizens first, like I said, they identify with their nationality instead of being British or part of the UK. Because of this, we have seen nationalist parties advocating for devolution, including the Scottish National Party and the Welsh Plaid Cymru. UK political values have been strongly influenced by classical liberalism and its ideas that government's influence over people has limits. While post-war politics led to adoption of some social democratic values, economic decline in the 1970s swung the pendulum back toward an economic focus on personal freedom. The old system of elite rule is increasingly being challenged by new political realities. There are signs that some segments of the population may be frustrated with certain aspects of British politics and British culture. Okay, so let's swing towards political economy now. We're getting close to the end here. We want to finish this up. We should be seeing kind of a step-by-step each of the chapters, those 7 chapters that we've done, falling into place now in this lecture. So let's switch to the political economy, chapter 4. The economy has been declining since World War II. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There are several possible reasons for this problem. For one thing, early industrialization means the downside is manifested earlier than in other countries. Moreover, after a while, its empire was a burden financially more than it was a benefit. Finally, many political scientists have argued that the post-war collectivist consensus focused the country on social expenditures while ignoring the need to modernize the country. They became the welfare state after World War II, right? And so they're saying they spent so much on that we didn't improve the country, they didn't modernize the country. So post-industrial economy, the service sector, privatization means a smaller role for the state in the economy. The government has sold Rolls-Royce, Jaguar, British Airways, and the welfare state has moved to welfare-to-work programs. Until the 2008 recession, the UK did better economically than France, Germany, Japan, yet by 2011, it had a per capita GDP that was lower than the former colonies of Ireland and Australia. The euro was introduced in 2002, but the UK opted out of that currency as part of the European Union. Changing to a single currency would have reduced the UK's ability to respond to its own challenges. They would have been wrapped up in that economy like Greece, like the countries were with Greece. But it would also have been able to avoid the stress of exchange rate fluctuations between the euro and the pound. So we're starting to wrap things up, but one last thing we've got to look at is foreign policy. And the UK is still a world player. On the world scene, Great Britain sees itself as separate from the continent of Europe. It holds a mentality of island and empire, and it sees the United States as an important ally and will fight for its interest, as it did in the Falkland Islands in 1982. These tiny islands off of Argentina only had about 2,000 inhabitants, but in the war which the United Kingdom won, 200 British and 600 Argentinian soldiers died. The UK also supported the war in Iraq. So initially, the United Kingdom did not want to be part of the European Union because it wanted to be able to protect its interests. But then it decided to join, but the French decided to try and keep the UK out for a while. It kind of made them wait in line a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up today with the current issues in the UK. So Scotland is number one. The Scottish Nationalist Party was formed in the 1930s, and in 1974 it won a third of the vote in Scotland and sent 11 MPs, members of Parliament, to the House of Commons in London. In 1998, with devolution, Blair gave Scotland its own legislature and government. Scotland has had its own legal system, but it now has policies that differ from the rest of the United Kingdom, including free tuition and lower health care costs. Independence is probably not feasible because it has no military and strong ties to work in England. But moreover, Blair, Brown, and the Speaker of the House of Commons are all Scottish. The Scottish Nationalist Party won in 2007 in regional elections and then again in 2011. So it scheduled a referendum on home rule for September 2014. However, that didn't go their way, and 56% of votes cast were ballots against independence. In the wake of Brexit now, though, there is a renewed campaign for Scottish independence as more than 2/3 of Scots voted to remain in the European Union. So they're going against what the United Kingdom has voted to do. Many Britons fear that a stronger EU will become a superstate. As of 2014, the United Kingdom was the country with the lowest population percentage saying that they could trust the EU. Only 22% of those in the United Kingdom said that they could trust the EU. Increased tensions over the migrant crisis compounded feelings of distrust over membership in the European Union, and Cameron promised that a majority Conservative government would renegotiate EU membership terms and then put in or out referendum to the population, which occurred in 2016. They did not expect the people to say, let's go, okay? They expected the people to reaffirm the EU membership. But that's obviously not what happened. In the result of the referendum was 52% choosing to leave, 48% choosing to remain, a result that surprised the UK and the world. In the wake of Brexit now, Cameron resigns and Theresa May has become the Prime Minister, forming a cabinet of outspoken leave proponents and now currently trying to negotiate a deal for Brexit from the UK. So my friends, lots of stuff to dive into here, but make sure that you can break these things apart, okay? Make sure that you can say, here is what the regime is. Here is how Parliament is elected. Here's the cleaves in the UK. Make sure that you can kind of compartmentalize each of these things so that when we start studying Russia and we start China and we look at Iran and Mexico and Nigeria, we can say, okay, this compartment here fits into this compartment here, even though they're not similar, they're not the same thing, but we know that this is political culture, or we know that these are the cleavages here, or we know that this is the regime here. We can start comparing things on a higher level. My friends, I hope you have a wonderful night. I'm going to see you tomorrow in class, and have a great day.